Hi, this is Chris Haughey. Thank you for joining me on Create with Chris. Today I will be showing you how to use stencils to elevate simple designs and add that wow factor. Be sure to watch until the end to see the amazing transformation with just a few tips, tricks, and techniques. So grab your brushes and let's get started. I use multi-purpose sealer to seal it and an 1.5 inch wash, pulling the product away from the center toward the outer edges to keep the product from dripping down the side edges. The wide brush has a soft bristle which puts the product on nice and smooth, eliminates any brush stroke marks. Use the stylus to stick in the hole in the corner, it just holds the plaque in place. Give it a quick dry and lightly sand it with a fine grit sandpaper. Doing the same thing with black green to put a nice smooth base coat on. And I think you can see with the color how smoothly that brush does apply the paint. Again, pulling it from the center toward the outer edges, and it will need 2 coats. Position the stencil, make sure that it's evenly placed around all the edges, and secure it well with a piece of painter's tape. Do make sure your base coat is nice and dry. To stencil the letters on, I am using warm white. It's just a little more opaque, and my spectacular stencil brush. Load the brush well with the paint, but I don't want a heavy paint on the tips of the bristles, so I am just brushing it over a paper towel to remove that excess paint. I'm doing a very light swirl dry brush over the letters to keep those edges nice and clean and crisp. Use a very gentle touch and keep the paint very light. And I know it's hard not to put it on heavy and solid. It's so much better to add several light coats, especially when working with a light color over a dark base. I remove the tape, and because the paint is so very thin, I can reposition the tape and not worry about pulling the paint off. Now I did go back 2 times with the warm white just to give an even coverage. And this is just basically the base coat to make sure that I have a nice even base to put the paint on. Now the stencils have a little bridge in them, which I'm not real crazy about, so sometimes they work out, sometimes I like to go back, and I'm just using my number 2 radical round to touch up those bridges. Now I'm going back with Snow White, and Snow White is a much brighter white, and this also will take a couple coats. Patience. Stenciling is about patience, but if you want it to look fantastic, if you want the edges nice and clean and crisp, keep a very light touch. Heavy paint is not your friend when it comes to stenciling. If you've not tried my spectacular stencil brushes, I designed those. The bristles are super soft so that the paint glides on. I never like dealing with those thick, heavy stencil brushes. So with these soft bristles, it's almost like an airbrush effect. Now I did go back and do a couple coats, and you can see how much whiter, brighter the candy cane lane is. I did not do the border. I do go back and connect the bridges on the letter A. The other separations in the letters I think look great, but I thought that little bridge on that A was kind of too much. Now I am using a stripe stencil to create those candy cane stripes. Hang in with me, because when they're first stenciled they look kind of awful, but that's part of the magic of decorative painting. We can take all of these elements, put them together, comes out looking fantastic. I'm just deciding on the angle of the stripe, and once I get it in place, I do anchor that back down underneath the candy cane lane stencil. And you can see how that's going to mask off each letter. And I keep an eye on the stripe stencil because it's only so wide. So if I stencil into the next section, the stripes are going to be much larger and wider. So I'm doing the letter C, and then I take a look at it and I decide I may not remember where that stripe section ends, so I'm using my painter's pal to just remind me where to stop with that stripe stenciling. And this looks like it's being applied heavily, but I'm just tapping it instead of swirling it. And when it's tapped instead of swirled, obviously it's not a dry brush, so more paint is being applied. So the results are just a little bit stronger. Very slow, very careful. Too much paint is just going to run under, especially when working with a double layer of stencils. Now I'm just realigning that stencil, and I'm using the last stripe as a guideline to continue on the same angle throughout all of the letters. And make sure everything is anchored down. Keeping both of the stencils secure will ensure perfect results. And just continue stenciling. I don't want to forget where that stencil ends. Sometimes I get involved in what I'm doing and I kind of forget about that. So you can see how the stripes continue on. Again, I'm just realigning according to that last stripe. This takes a little bit of time, but believe me, it's so much easier than trying to use a brush to add each one of those candy stripes. They're going to be exactly perfect, exactly spaced apart, and they're going to look terrific. If you are enjoying this video, please like, hit the bell, and subscribe. That way you won't miss out on upcoming videos. I would love to hear from you, so let me know if you have any comments or questions, or if there is another technique you would like me to share. This is such a great way to overlay stencils to create design on a design. And this can be done with any stencil, any design stencil. Just put the design on the bottom and the shape stencil on top, anchor them down really, really well, and then stencil through both stencils. And it's just a great, simple way to add amazing design, and it does look like it's very professional because everything will be perfect. And I do double check to make sure that that last stripe is lined up correctly. I wasn't sure as I was stenciling on the first layer of stripes if it would need 2 coats, but I decided to try it with just 1 coat because it was so time intensive. And I thought, well, probably because of all the shading and highlighting I was going to add to it, as long as the stripes were nice and even, that it would look great. And I only did the 1 coat, and I honestly think it wouldn't make a difference if it were 1 coat or 2 coats. Now, if you were going to not add the additional shading and highlighting, probably should go back and put a 2nd coat on. But these stripes were very small, and the letters are not very big, so the design on it didn't need to be that strong with all the other added elements to enhance it. If you like to stencil but have problems with the bristle stencil brushes, be sure to take a look at my spectacular stencil brushes. I worked a couple years to develop these and pick the right bristle for the brush. It's soft enough that it's just so versatile. I can even use it as a base coat brush. But the bristles can be washed out between colors, and there's no need for them to dry completely before picking up the next color. Now, while I had the stencil in place, I went ahead and did the border around the outer edge. This has that nice light background on it, so it's going to be real easy to put that red on and get a nice bright true red. And again, I'm just kind of very lightly tapping it on. As always, make sure before or after picking up paint on the palette that the brush is wiped over a paper towel a couple times just to remove excess paint. That will ensure those crisp, clean edges that are so important when stenciling. Now that I've removed it, I see that bridge, so I'm just using my brush to connect those so it looks like it was beautifully hand painted with a nice steady hand, and just kind of blending that all together. It's such a simple way, but look how nice that looks. Picked up some fiery neons, and I don't paint with this very often, but I thought with all of these really dark background colors that I wanted this red to resonate and have a real strong glow to it. So I'm putting that in the middle of each section of the border, just a brush stroke. It's not a strong stop and start, but I just kind of blended it out, let the brush kind of drag over the ends to soften it so I don't have a sharp start and stop. So it just gives that hint of a glow. Fiery red is very strong color, and I like the way it looks, so I thought, well, I think I'll put a little bit in the middle of each one of those stripes. And again, you can see it's just a simple brush stroke to add a little bit of a highlight. Sometimes red can be very dull, and this is just going to perk it up and give it that strength and vibrancy that we want at Christmas time. And it's just that quick, just a simple brush stroke in the middle of each one of these stripes. And what a world of difference a little bit of paint makes. I do think that's my motto. And I'm using my number 2 Radical Round, another brush I developed that will give you a lot of bang for the brush. It has a fatter belly on it than a regular round, so I can load a lot of paint in it, do a lot of brush strokes before I have to reload, which I think is so key in decorative painting. I loaded the toe of my Awesome angle with deep burgundy, and I'm just kind of floating it down the left-hand side of each one of the letters. Now when it comes to that bridge on the A where the horizontal laps over, I'm going to let that be in front. So I'm shading behind it, so that will be the highlight. My shading is down the left side and across the bottom. Vice versa, the highlights will be along the top and down the left side. Using the 1/4 inch Awesome angle, another brush I designed. It's just a little bit longer in length. It allows for a longer stroke before it needs to be reloaded. And when I'm shading and I get a nice float going on, I don't want to have to stop in the middle and reload. So this is a very nice brush with the extra length to be able to easily shade a long distance before reloading and continuing. And you can see already what a difference just that little bit of paint down the left side has done, not only to the shape of the letters, but it's also enhancing the side edge of the stripes. So if the stripes were a little bit uneven or the stenciling wasn't quite perfect, this will blend it in very nicely, and the small areas that maybe were standing out before are going to be very subtle. I always recommend continuing on before fussing over fixing something that's maybe not even going to show at the end. So I decided at this point some of the stripes I wasn't completely happy with, but I decided I would go ahead and shade and highlight and then revisit and see if I actually needed to go back and spend that extra time cleaning them up or fixing them up. I call that fussy painting. But I don't think I ended up going back, and I didn't really need to touch up any of the stripes. So keep that in mind. Go ahead and put the shading on it and see what it looks like. On the C that I'm working on now, I did notice that some of the left side edges, the stripe didn't get quite to the edge. I left a little white part, and when I added the shading, it just blended it in very, very nicely. And you can see how they're starting. I thought at this point they still look pretty bad, but they're starting to come together. And that's the magic of decorative painting. It doesn't take much, but just that little bit. And I did bump down to an 1/8 inch angle on some of those smaller areas just because it's kind of difficult with a bigger brush to be super precise in tiny areas. Just continuing that over. It's almost kind of magical what that little bit of shading will do to these letters. I did add a light float of deep burgundy on these to shade them. Let it dry, and if it's needed, if there's more shading needed, I could go back and touch it up, but I decided I would add the highlights on next, and I'm using Snow White just to brighten those up. And look how that really starts to pull it together. Use the toe of my angle to sharpen up that left side, and then just let a little bit of that highlight float across. I didn't want to lose that neon red highlight that was on the middle of each of the stripes, so I was kind of careful on the skinny part of the letters, especially not to let that come too far across. I think on the skinny part of the letters, it's more of a tiny short floated line. I did bump down to an 1/8 inch angle so I could have a little more precise control. I thought initially that after the highlights were added, I would probably need to go back and deepen the shading. But as I'm floating this on, I really like that look of the lighter candy cane effect as opposed if I would have darkened the shading. So take time to look at what's being painted to see if some steps are really necessary. Often we really don't know until the paint is applied what or how much paint is needed. And you can see how bright and light the lettering becomes just with that little bit of floating. As white dries often, it becomes much, much lighter. So even though I'm a little light-handed and I don't want it real heavy, as it dries, take a look at it. I did go back and reinforce some of the highlights just a little bit. Also, it helps to straighten up edges, clean up any areas that might not be perfectly straight compared to where the stripe stenciling has been added. Now that the shading and highlighting has been added, I want to go back and add a real strong reflection line. And that's where a lot of impact is created. And I'm just pulling it down more towards the middle left side of each letter. Pay attention on the thin parts if there's enough room to add a tiny little highlight. It will make a difference. It does ramp it up and really make that look very dimensional, almost kind of glossy and wet. I am using the Epic Script Liner and thinned Snow White, and that will really put a nice fine line. The Epic Script Liner is a little bit longer than a regular liner, but shorter than a script, which provides more control. If the paint's not flowing, add a little bit of moisture to the brush, a little bit of water to help it flow to achieve that perfect slender. I've loaded my number 2 Radical Round with just a bit of Snow White, and I'm very lightly pulling it over the middle of each section of the border to create a soft, kind of a shimmering highlight. And that's going to help pull the letters in the border together quietly while still maintaining continuity with the coloring. And you can see how that just adds that little splash of light on each section of the border. The holly leaves have been base coated with Hauser light green, just 1 or 2 even coats. Loading the toe of my 1/4 inch awesome angle with Hauser dark green, shading the bottom side and down the center vein. And I want to make sure when I do the center vein that I add just a little bit of a curve to that. I think it just adds a little more movement to the leaves instead of having them look like they're just flat. Not too worried about the center area of the leaves because I am going to be putting berries in there. I'm just beginning to add the first layer of shading, and it's a very light float. It doesn't take much. Now I'm going back with citron green to add highlights. This will be on the top of the leaves and on the opposite side of the center vein. And this again is the first layer of highlights just to start shaping those leaves. I always think I can go back and add more to if I need it, as opposed to wishing I would not have put it on so heavy. So I traditionally use just a small amount of paint, do light floats, and then I can build it up very quickly and very easily. I've loaded my Epic script liner with the citron green, and I'm just pulling a real fine center vein and a couple little side veins up to the points of the holly leaves. Keep that paint nice and fluid so it flows off of the brush. If the brush is dragging, be sure to add a little bit more water in the brush to make that paint really roll off the brush. I think the first tendency when the brush starts to drag is to push down, and that's when wide blotchy lines are created. I decided that that was just a little bit too bright, but I liked the contrast because it really showed up. And when using the same colors, it's real easy for some areas to blend in. So I loaded my Epic script liner with Hauser dark green, and I'm just pulling a little line to the side of each one of those veins. In addition to helping them stand out, it creates a little more dimension on those leaves. And I'm just going back now with my 1/4 inch angle and the citron green just to ramp up those highlights just a little bit. I really want these leaves to be bright. Everything on this plaque is either red or dark green, so the leaves are going to be what really gives a pop of color. I'm using my painter's palette to stencil the holly berries, and I'm using warm white. I want to just get that base in there. Make sure to clean the stencil off every time a berry is stenciled, because if not, it's going to be hard with the paint on there. You can't see behind it. So if it's cleaned off, placement is very easy to view. I stenciled these on the first time and decided that they weren't big enough, so I did move up to a bigger circle to create the berries. I want the center area to be really full. And want to make sure this is a nice even coat. The candy cane was base coated with Snow White. I'm going in with my Fabulous Flat to create true red stripes. Just kind of eyeballed it and just created that curve, and that's kind of my natural curve with the way I pull my brush down. I found out everyone has a certain stroke that's very comfortable, and if you keep to that, it's going to work out really well. I did go back and put a second coat on just to strengthen. I did want those stripes to be red. Because red often becomes pinkish when it's thinned down, I painted the double lines in between the wide stripes with deep burgundy. It just gives a richer stripe and shows up nice and strong, as opposed to thinning down the red. It becomes a little bit translucent and not quite so vivid. And I wanted these to be really strong. The Epic script liner should be able to paint quite a few stripes before reloading. If not, your brush is not loaded correctly and needs a little more moisture. Let it dry well, and then I'm taking my 1/2 inch Awesome Angle and Deep Burgundy to shade down the left side and of both sections. So it's the left side of the the shaft and then also the left side of the hook. Let that dry, and then I wanted it to kind of match those letters on the plaque, so I highlighted the opposite side with Snow White. Let that dry and take a look at it to see if another more floating or shading needs to be highlighted. Pull a thin line of Snow White with the Epic script liner down that middle right side, just to add that reflective highlight. What a difference that makes. Going back now, I'm using my Painter's Pal template as a stencil and my number 3 Spectacular stencil brush to top coat those berries with True Red. Keep an eye on that stencil. If it becomes too wet, it will smear off. So keep an eye on it, wipe it off often. Make sure that it doesn't create any problems underneath. I did let it dry, and I'm shading around the bottom left sides of each berry with deep burgundy. And to create these berries, I do fuss with them a little bit because I want it to be kind of a focal point with the leaves. Adding that neon fiery red. Love that impact that it has, very bright. Doesn't take much. I didn't blend it in real smooth. I wanted it to be strong. This is the Hauser dark green, and I'm just tucking it around those berries, and it's very thin, so I can go over the veins and they will still show through. It's not solid and dark. And I'm sorry, that is black green. I wanted it to be very strong. Wasn't too worried about the shape of my berries, and I'll show you why in just a second. I just wanted to create that depth that makes the berries look like they're snuggled down in the middle of those cluster of holly leaves. Using the toe of my angle just to tuck it around, and then I'm going back to deepen the shading on the berries with that same black green, and you can see I can shape the berries and make them look nice and round. So they looked a little wonky before, but after adding the shading, they start to really look great. Epic script liner and Snow White to add in some comma strokes. I was really light-handed with it and decided I wanted a little bit stronger. Because the plaque looks a little bit plain, I thought sprinkling it with snow would be really pretty. I'm using the splatter brush. It has long nylon bristles. Put some thin paint on my palette, and I'm tapping just the tips of the brush into the paint, holding the brush on the clean part and just really flicking it. And I'm standing up and pointing the brush down. Wherever the brush is pointed, that's where the snow's going, or the splatter's going to land. The closer the brush is to the surface, the smaller the splatter. The further away, the larger the splatter pattern. Adding some splatter on the holly leaves and berries as well as the candy cane, it just helps pull it all together. I did splatter the candy cane only with a little bit of black green just to give a little more interest and volume. Any wayward splatters can be easily lifted with a damp cotton tip swab. Arranging the pieces and using Aleene's tacky glue to adhere them securely in place is a great glue to work with. Want to make sure that the leaves don't cover the lettering and the candy cane is positioned in the corner so that just a little bit of that outside border edge on the sign is still visible. This piece can be varnished with ultra matte varnish or a spray varnish just to protect it. I love how it turned out and hope that you learned a few new tips and techniques that you can use to make your stenciling a little more amazing. I would love to hear from you, so let me know if you have any comments or questions. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to our next painting adventure together. And remember, a little bit of paint makes a big difference.